Los Fresnos, Texas. And here on this channel, I am Brad's brother, and I am a guest, and I'm delighted that you've allowed me to be here. And if you want to know where Los Fresnos is, well, as a crow flies, we're about 15 minutes from the border here in deep South Texas. So I hope you're having a good Thanksgiving week. We're going to talk a little bit about Thanksgiving. And usually when we're talking about Thanksgiving and in Thanksgiving week, I always want to know, what are you thankful for this week? So when anybody's asking the question on Thursday, what are you thankful for? It's always a good thing to ask, because again, it forces us to think about a lot of the good things in life and the things that matter most in life. So it's always a good exercise. In fact, again, there's a lot of research that talks about gratitude being one of those things that is helpful for your health. And so we're kind of reminded of that too. There's something to be said about the attitude of gratitude. And so we get to think about that during Thanksgiving. What are we thankful for? When we're talking about the Psalms, a lot of times we as Christians turn to the Psalms during this week because there's a lot of Psalms that talk about Thanksgiving. Talk about Thanksgiving in prayer, talk about Thanksgiving in poetry, and talk about the things to be thankful for. There's just a lot of thanksgiving and praise in the Psalms. And I'm always amazed at how many times the Psalms use the word thanks or thankful or thanksgiving. In fact, multiple Psalms have multiple uses of the word thankfulness because they are actually thanksgiving songs or psalms that we find in the book of Psalms. One of those Psalms where the word shows up multiple times is Psalm 107, and I thought that today would be a good day to look at Psalm 107 as we think about Thanksgiving and Thanksgiving week. So that it's not just going to be turkey and football and Thanksgiving, but we're actually thinking about something to be thankful for. And this is what the psalmist is thankful for in Psalm 107. In fact, I'm going to show you how this really is to be used and can be used to understand all the different ways that the word thanks or thanksgiving is being used in the Psalms. Now, Psalm 107 is a psalm of rescue and redemption. Most likely it is a song or a poem that was written after Israel or Judah came back from exile in Babylon. So they've been rescued from Babylon. They're back in the land, and so this would make this one of those late psalms. It's not written during the time of David and Solomon, but it's a little later. And whoever's writing this has put together this song and incorporates a lot of the themes from Psalms that were earlier. But it's about the rescue that they have experienced. And it is a unique psalm. We'll get to that in a second. It's also the first book of it's the first psalm of the last book, or the fifth book in the Psalms. The Psalms are divided into 5 books, and many think that's after the 5 books of Moses. But this is the first psalm in the last section, or the last book. And the theme of the last book is the return of the king, anticipating a king that is coming. You know, all of the Psalms have some touch point with royalty and the king. In fact, that's why, again, David is king. And even Solomon, they were the ones that put the psalm book together for the most part, or it was people in their court or people in the temple of their reign that put this psalm book together, the Psalms. And so, Psalm 1, Psalm 2, Psalm 3, those are the early psalms talking about a king. And these psalms were sung and read on Coronation Day for Israel's kings. And so you've got this running theme of king and royalty throughout most of the Psalms, as well as the Messiah, because the Messiah, all of the Psalms have some sort of touch point with the Messiah. And this Messiah is seen as a royal figure, a king figure that is coming at some point in Israel's future. So Psalm 107 the first psalm in that last book, and that last book is really looking forward to this coming king, the return of a king to Israel. Now, Psalm 107 is unique. It's got some different elements in it that we don't typically find in some of the other psalms. It's emphasizing God's works on behalf of his people. And all of it is summarized in the first verse. The first verse is a key verse. And it's a verse, like I said, that's common to all the Psalms and gets incorporated here. And this is what it says. First verse of Psalm 107. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. I mean, those are very, very familiar words in the Psalms. Many Psalms have this line. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. Now, we're not going to get into all the different meanings of this word for faithful love, but it's like this is this common theme that the Lord, Yahweh, is to be thanked. He's to be given thanks. Number one, because he's good, and number two is because he has a faithful love for Israel. He has a faithful love for his people that endures forever. So those two things, his goodness and his forever love. But in this psalm, we're also supposed to see something else. God's goodness and his love, his forever love, are actually in action on behalf of his people. You can see something concrete. Again, all the psalms that have this line typically are putting something concrete to it. In other words, it's not an abstract. It's just not some phrase that just somehow flows out of the heart, and it's just some sort of generic praise of thanksgiving to God, but it has something specifically tied to it. There's a reason why we're thankful to God for his goodness and his forever love. And that comes up here, but it's interesting how this is put into concrete form. God's goodness and his love here in Psalm 107 can be seen in God's rescue and his redemption of his people. And there are 4 different groups or categories of people that are mentioned here in this particular psalm. And there's a section that goes with each 4 of these groups or categories. And the first is the homeless, or those who are hungry and thirsty. The second group that's supposed to give thanks is prisoners who are in prison because of their sin. In other words, the sin's been self-inflicted, but it's prisoners. And then the third category is people, those who are sick or near death. And then the fourth one is somebody going through a natural disaster. Here it's sailors in a storm that is out of control. They've been rescued. So all 4 of these groups of people, whether they're sinners by their own choice or whether things have happened to them in either sickness or some sort of natural thing that's going on, like a natural disaster, like a storm, all these groups are to be given thanks. And I also tend to think that all 4 of these categories could be wrapped up into Israel's experience in Babylon as a people in exile. They were refugees there. They were living in a land that was outside of their own, in a culture that wasn't their own, with a language that wasn't their own. And now they're back. And so they're this idea of being in prison or being sick, being hungry and thirsty, I'm sure that this kind of summarizes their experience there in Babylon. Now, we're not going to get into all the great things that are said here about each of these different groups or categories. That would be great. But what we're supposed to see also here isn't just Israel's experience, but we're supposed to see something of ourselves in all of these categories. It's why it was written down in poem form or in a song form, because that experience now is being brought to the individual, or is being brought to the group. In other words, we are now living and singing and saying this poem in solidarity with those people that went through all that, and giving thanks to God for all that. The other thing, too, that you have here is this rhythm. The first thing is, in these categories or these groups, as they're expressed in this psalm, we're supposed to see that there's a description of their plight. Then they cry out to God, and then God hears and rescues. And that rhythm is, here's the plight, here's what's going on, here's their dilemma, here's their difficulty, here's their issue, here's their suffering, here's their cry, here's their, hey, God, we need help. And then there's God's response. God hears, and then God acts on their behalf. God rescues. That's the rhythm. Those three things are going on in all of these groups as well. And then at the end, at the end of each of these categories, then is a phrase or a stanza that is repeated 4 times after all 4 groups. So the fourfold repetition here in Psalm 107 is this: let those who've been rescued, give thanks to the Lord for his faithful love and his wondrous works for all humanity. So that gets repeated over and over and over again. Let those who've been rescued give thanks to the Lord for his faithful love, there's that word that's in that first verse, and his wondrous works for all humanity. So when we hear this, then, in this context, what are the wondrous works for all humanity? What are these wondrous works? Well, the wondrous works in this psalm are God's rescue, God's deliverance, God's salvation of the hungry and the thirsty, the prisoners, those who are going through sickness or natural disasters, sinners. It's God's rescue of his people. That's his wondrous works. God's rescues are God's deliverances. God's salvation are his wondrous works. And all these rescues are because God is good and he has a forever love for his people. So you understand? The categories, here's the plight, here's the response from God, and then we give God thanks because his faithful love and his wondrous works are for all humanity. But I'm picking up on this because giving thanks to God for his wondrous works is all over the Psalms. Again, wherever we're finding these things of thanksgiving, and his awesome, it's either his wondrous works or his awesome deeds or his great deeds, his wondrous deeds. That kind of language is throughout the Psalms, giving thanks to God for his mighty acts, his acts of power. And often when we talk about this is kind of the myth-busting part of this. Typically when we think of God's wondrous acts or his awesome deeds, we think of things like, okay, his creation of the world, or he's helped me out of, or he's helped whoever the psalmist is out of some difficulty. Or he's just being given thanks for just being a great guy, for being a great guy. The great God for who he is. And it's just ends up being kind of abstract. But in this psalm, and in fact in the other psalms, there is a context to these wondrous works. They're not just some general wondrous works. Again, you hear me out. We're not saying that it's never that. What we are saying is, though, that there is one primary understanding of these wondrous works and awesome deeds, and that is his rescue of his people. Salvation. And in this psalm, the rescue of sinners. So anytime you see this phrase in the Psalms, we need to be thinking about this is giving thanks to God for all of his wondrous works, the wondrous works of saving his people from their sins. So when we try to understand that here in our context, in 2024, what are his wondrous works? What are his awesome deeds? Well, that is Jesus and his cross and the resurrection on behalf of his people. That's the wondrous works. Yes, again, not saying it can't be creation. Not saying that it's not Jesus helping me out in a difficult situation or a difficult conversation sometime this week. Those are wondrous works, don't get me wrong. But when we're talking about how it's going down in these Psalms and what the thanksgiving is really for, it's what he has done for us in Jesus through the cross and resurrection. So the fourfold repetition here in Psalm 107 is really this: let those who've been rescued from their sin and guilt and the devil and death give thanks to the Lord for his faithful love and his wondrous works of going to the cross, his wondrous works of forgiveness, salvation, life, grace. Those are his wondrous works. So Jesus and his death, That's God's wondrous deed for all humanity. I mean, that's why Paul says over and over that we preach Christ crucified. Why? Because that's his wondrous work. In fact, Christ's cross is the most wonderful, is the most glorious, is the most stupendous. There's nothing more majestic. There is nothing greater in all of human history than Christ's death and resurrection. His work of salvation for us. That is his awesome deed and deeds. His forgiveness, his grace, his mercy, his love, his salvation, his life that he gives to us. All that a gift. That's his wondrous works, his wondrous deeds. So, Jesus and his death. We come to Psalm 107 and we're thinking about this. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. And how do we know that his faithful love endures forever? Well, the cross. The cross. That's how we know. And we're told that then each Sunday. We're given that each Sunday at the table, in word and in sacrament. Those wondrous works. So the end of the psalm, let whoever is wise pay attention to these things. So there's a connection to wisdom here. And consider the Lord's acts of faithful love. What are those Lord's acts? Well, his rescue of his people. His death and resurrection for us. And again, that includes the instances of grace and mercy that we get each and every day of our lives in all sorts of different ways. His grace and mercy are coming into our lives. But make no mistake, even those little things that show up in the mundane where God is giving us grace and mercy in the moment still are tied to. They were bought and paid for at the cross. And they're given to us in the cross, in the resurrection, in our baptism, and at the table, in the word and sacrament every Sunday. So, that is the Thanksgiving thought for this week. Psalm 107. It all originates in Christ's cross and resurrection for you and for me. That is today's rhythm. Today's rhythms of grace, this week's rhythms of grace for me. Again, I enjoy this. I enjoy all the other different devotionals that we're hearing on a weekly basis here on this channel. And again, I'm super excited to be here, and I'm so privileged that you would allow me to do this. So thank you. Hope you have a great Thanksgiving, and I hope you enjoy it with family and friends. And until next time, again, remember that Jesus is all you ever need. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. And that is God's wondrous works for you.